Okay, so we just want to display a score uh, in the game um, scene. And so with the score, this is sort of part of our user interface in that it's not part of like the game world, but it's going to go in the game scene. And we're just going to update the score. In my example game, the score is just going to reflect the number of birds that the player has eaten. But depending on how your game is set up, you may want it to reflect different things. For example, if the object in your scene is an enemy or something like that, maybe your player has a certain number of lives that they start out with, and they lose those lives if they get hit by the enemy. You could have something for both cases. So depending on what you want to happen in your game, you may have something slightly different. But we're just going to create a score. And so I'll just create the code for the score first, and then we'll change the styling by adding a font. So I'm going to start out with a variable to track the score. This will be a global variable because the score will be displayed in the game scene, but it'll also be updated in different places potentially. So we're going to make it a global variable. I'm just going to put it up here with my other variables, so I'll just call this score. And I'll set it to equal to 0 to start. If you're tracking like the score, you might want to start at 0 and go up. If you're tracking the player lives or health or something like that, you want to start at a higher number and go down. It just kind of depends on the context. So the score, I'm just going to say counts the number of birds eaten. And we can set up some game logic to say once you eat a certain number of birds, you win the game. So we'll just have the score here, and we just want to display it. We're going to display it in the game scene. So I'm going to find this game function, which draws the game. So it draws the player and the bird, and then it detects the collision between the player and the bird. And it doesn't really matter what order we put this in, but I want it to go kind of on top of everything else, so I'm going to draw it at the bottom. So I'm just going to put a UI score display. So I'll just put a comment here. And as I'm debugging this, something that is kind of good to know when it comes to, when we have a more complicated setup, when I run the game, it's always going to open on this menu screen. But I'm not testing the menu screen, and so it kind of adds like an extra step to testing the game where I have to actually start the game before I'm going to see the score that I want to display. So when I'm testing, what I could do is just scroll back up to the top and just set the game state to 2 to start out with. And then I can always go back and set it back to 0. But this way I don't have to waste a step. I can just start at the game state, and that'll make it easier for me to see the changes that I'm making. So I'm just going to set the game state to 2, and then we're going to display the score. So in P5, we can draw text on the screen, just like in any application. We couldn't do that in Scratch, which is why we had to make sprites for the digits, and then kind of had this like kind of hacky, goofy way of displaying the score. But in P5, we can just write text on the screen. So I'm going to use text, which is the function that draws text. And text just takes whatever value or text that we want to display. So if I just want to display score, I can just write score here. And then that's the first argument, and then it takes a position, X and Y. So if I put the position at something like 2020, it's going to be up in the top left corner, and we're going to see it there. And if I want it to be on the other side of the page, I could increase the X value. I could set it to 400, and then it'll go over there. It just kind of depends on where you want it to go. And then I can display the score, but I can also just display the score as a value. So we'll see that it's 0. And it's not going to change because we haven't programmed anything to actually change the score at this point. So we're just displaying the score. We can update the score. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger just so it's easier to see. So I'm going to set the text size to 40. I think that'll be pretty large, maybe 30. Yeah, that's pretty good. And I'm going to move it down a little bit on the page. And then I can write score next to it, but I could also just maybe use my little bird icon as an example. So I could add an image here and add in my bird flying sprite. And I'll just put it next to the score. So I'll put it at like 380 and 40, something like that. And then I just want to line them up a little bit. So I actually want to move this over a little bit. I'm going to do like 420, maybe 440. And then I'll move my bird over. And then looks like I need to go up a little bit. There we go. Okay, so, and maybe I'll make the fill red so they'll match. So the text, just like our shapes, uses the fill or outline. So now I have this little icon that kind of represents the score. And of course you could use a different icon, like you could design an icon that's separate from the bird image. I'm just using the bird image just because I already have it. So then we need to decide when to change the score, and this is going to introduce a little bit of an issue, which is very similar to the one that we ran into with our button click. So it'll be a good chance to kind of review what we want to do there. So I want to add one score to the player when the player eats a bird. So in here, I'm detecting the collision between the player and the bird. And then if they collide, I'm deciding what to do here. So the player does an eat animation, and the bird does a die animation. And I play this sound, and that's pretty much it. So in here, I can also update the score. So I could say score equals score plus 1. So I can add 1 to the score. And so if we do this, it'll work, but we're going to see there's an issue that's similar to our clicking issue. So notice that each time I eat the bird, I'm scoring more than once. And sometimes I'm scoring like a lot. Okay, so there's different ways to deal with this. I could put a variable inside the bird that says, like, you know, only eat me if I am not already eaten. I could put a variable up here that says, you know, let is eaten, and then go that way. To make my game work better as I add more features, you kind of have to make decisions about what the best way to deal with something is. It's not always necessarily clear. Sometimes you have to kind of change your decision. So one way I could do this is just in this game logic here. I could say let bird was eaten equal false, and then I could say if not bird was eaten, I can add to the score. And then I can say bird was eaten equals true. And so now if I do this multiple times, it's going to ignore this one. So it's very similar to saying if the meow sound is already playing, then I don't want to eat the bird. So we should see if this should fix the issue. Nope. Okay. Where did I miss my logic? Oh, you know what? I'm in the main game loop, so that variable is just getting reset all the time. So I would actually have to add that somewhere else in the global scope. So it already doesn't work, so we should do something else anyway. But even if it did work, the problem with this is that we have to do that for every bird in the global scope, which is not going to work very well. What we want to do is when we can put the code into the different objects so that each object gets to use the same code. So let's get rid of this. And we'll update our bird code to be more selective for when it allows itself to be eaten. Okay, so let's leave this for a moment. Let's go down and look at our bird. And so our bird can move and it can be displayed, and then we can get the position and we can also die. So when the bird dies, besides changing the animation state, we could also set a bird property to say that the bird is dead. We could then use that property to decide whether or not we can eat the bird. So we have X, Y, and speed. Let's add a let is dead. Why don't we say is alive? We'll say the bird is alive, and then if the bird gets eaten, it won't be alive anymore. So we'll say is alive is true. And when we die, we'll say is alive equals false. So now the bird is keeping track of its internal state, but it doesn't tell anything to the main program. But what we can do is when we get the position of the bird, we could also get the status of the bird. So we have this get position. It returns the X and Y. We could add the status in there, or we could just add a new function to add the status. If we want to, add the status here, then we probably need to update this variable to, get status. But let's just add another function so it's more clear what's going on. So let's add a function down here called get status. And here we'll just return is alive. And so this will be either true or false depending on whether the bird has been eaten. And so along with get position and die, we now have a new function to return, which is get status. So that can tell us whether the bird is alive or not. And we can check before we add the score. So here we're going to detect the bird collision. If the bird collides, we're going to eat and it's going to die, and we're going to play the sound, and we're going to do the score. But we really only want to do this if the bird status is alive. I guess we want to check is alive. Maybe just we can just use get status. So let's change this to if bird1 collide and bird1 dot get status. So if the get status is true, that means that the bird is alive. And so all of these things can happen. And now they're only going to happen once. So we can actually remove this sound code, and we can leave the score, and all this stuff should work great. Let's give it a try. And so when the bird dies, it will set is alive to false. And so then the bird.getStatus will be false, and so this whole thing will only happen once. So let's run that. Okay, so now we can eat the bird, and we just get 1 point. So that's great, but we have a new issue, and we ran into this issue when we were doing our button click. Now we can't eat another bird because we've set the status, and the status has no way of getting unset. So let's go back and look at our bird and see how we reset it. So in our move function, when the bird reaches the bottom of the canvas, we reset the position of the Y value, we reset X, we reset the speed, we reset the animation state, and what's really happening is that the bird is also becoming alive again, so we'll set is alive back to true, and now we'll be able to eat this new copy of the bird, which is really the same bird, just thrown back to the top of the screen. Okay, so one of the birds still doesn't work because we haven't implemented collision detection for bird 2. But bird 1 we can eat as many times as we want, and we will count up 1 each time. So you can see that when you're programming, a lot of problems have similar solutions. If we want something to only happen once, we have to check to see if it's happened or not. But then if we want it to be able to happen again, we have to create a condition for where, it can happen again. So there's a lot of similar patterns when we're creating an interactive project that we kind of recreate in different ways. All right, so let's make the score look a little bit more interesting. We're just using the default font right now, and we have options to use other fonts. So we can import a font. So we could use some of the default web fonts, but we could also import a special font. So let's go to fonts.google.com, and we can find a nice font to use for our game. I assume that you guys have probably used this before in one of your design courses, so I won't go over all of the basics, but we'll just look for a font. I already have a family selected, so let's get rid of that and go back to our home page. So maybe we'll find a pixel font to match our game. Let's see if there's some options. And you may want to obviously match your font to your game, but there's some kind of interesting ones, although some of these are hard to see. Okay, there aren't actually as many options as I thought there might be, but this one looks pretty funny. It's kind of like old-timey and pixel at the same time. That's kind of fun. But we're only going to be showing numbers, so why don't we put some numbers in here, see how that looks. It's kind of interesting. Some of the numbers go below the line and some of them go above, so that's kind of cool. Okay, so I like this. I'm gonna click get font, and for putting this into a P5, you have different options for how to do it. I prefer putting it into CSS because it is technically a style. So when I click on get embed code, instead of using the HTML, which is the first one that usually opens, I'm gonna go to @import, which is for CSS. And we have a CSS style sheet, so we don't need the style tags for the HTML. We can just copy the middle of this. So I'm just gonna copy that and then go back to P5. And so in style.css, we just need to make sure anything you import has to go before the rules. So I'm just gonna make an extra line up here, and I'll paste the font name here and save. And then I have to use this in P5, not in CSS. So if we look at what the font family value is here in their CSS code, that's actually what we have to use in P5, but we have to put it in a P5 function. So I'm just gonna copy this part, not the whole thing, and I'll go back to P5 and go to sketch.js. And so before I draw my text, I'm gonna change the text font, and I'm just gonna paste in that value in quotation marks. And so now we should see that font, and that looks kind of fun. I could probably, I might want to change the size to better match the bird. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I want to move it. I want to make it a little bit bigger and move it up a little bit. So maybe I'll make it like 36. And then I'm going to move, let's move this down here. And I'll move this up to 30. That's too high. Try 35. 36. Okay, that's pretty good. Maybe it's like 38. There we go. I think that's pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's nice to have it line up. Okay, so that looks pretty cool. It's a little bit more of a unique way to display the score. Okay, so we've got the score display. I never added the background to my game. Let's add the background at the top here. Forgot to do that earlier. Let's add background. We'll put in the game background image here. And this has to go at width over 2, height over 2, because we do want it to be centered. Uh-oh. Maybe we... Did I... No, I still have image mode center. Okay, what if I do 0, 0? Huh. Okay, what if I do width, height? Oh, whoops. Huh, that's weird. Okay, what if I do 500x? Huh. Okay. Oh, you know what? I shouldn't use the background function. I want to use the image function. I don't know why I was using background. Background is just for a solid color. I'm actually surprised it works, sort of, but I can't change the position. So width over 2, height over 2. Okay, there we go. I just want the image function there. Okay. So now what we want to do is create sort of a game win state. Again, this might be different depending on your game, but we just have to come up with some logic that when we get to some target point, we're going to go back to the game scene. And you could create an extra scene to make the game to have like a you win or something like that. I'm not going to add that in, but you would just want to make a new game state and make a new scene with some graphics or something like that. So if that's something that you want to add, you could work on that. Okay, so if I get to a certain score, I want to go back to the main menu, which is game state is 0. So let's try that. So I'm going to say if score is greater than or equal to 10, then game state equals 0. I think that's all we really have to do, so let's give it a shot. You can also use a lower score when you're testing if you don't want to have to actually play the game for that long. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. So we can kind of create a condition. Let's put a note here. So if player gets to 10, they win the game. And so that's indicated here in this sort of example just by going back to the main screen. That's fine. You could also, do something else. You could create a game win scene, or you could go to level 2. Maybe you add another bird and then keep counting to another score to make the game more challenging. All right, so last thing. I'm going to set the score a little bit lower for a second, and we're going to see one more issue that we have to fix. So if I win the game and then I start again, notice that I can't start the game again. Does any idea why that's happening?
There's no return? Like a return?
No. It's not related to that.
Didn't reset the actual game between, it's still actually playing it?
Sort of, but not exactly. So which part of it is not being reset? So what happens in the game when let's start it again. So the game state is determined by the score, right? If the score is greater than or equal to 2, then the game state goes back to 0. So right now the score is 0, so it's not going back to game state 0. When the score becomes 2, we go back to game state is 0. Okay, and now I can't get back to the game. So, exactly, the score is still at 2. So even when I click the start button and I try to go to the game, it still is using this logic. It's saying, well, the score is greater than or equal to 2, so we're going back to the main menu. So I could maybe go to the instructions menu, but I can't start the game. So what we need to do is reset the score. So we can just do that right here. If you have a lot of other things that you need to reset, you might want like a whole reset function. But we're just going to reset the game here. So I'm going to say score equals 0, reset the score / game. And so now I should be able to play the game again if I win. There we go. And so there's a lot of little details. Another thing you might notice is when I do win and then I reset the game, the birds get set to... the birds are still there. So depending on like how detail oriented you want to get, we could reset the birds. So in our birds right now, this is sort of like what happens when they get reset, but we don't have a function to do that. So we don't have the ability to reset the birds outside of the bird object. But if we want to, we can make a function and return it to the rest of the game. So why don't we create a reset function for our birds? We'll throw all this code in here. And instead of writing it all there, we'll just call reset from here. So we can, when we're inside of the bird, we're inside the bird here. If the bird hits the bottom of the screen, we can reset the bird. But we can also reset the bird from our main game function if we return. I just tidied it, but that always uncollapses everything. Let's collapse all this stuff. Okay, so now the bird has a reset function, and the bird can reset itself, but the main game can't because it doesn't have access to that. So let's go down to our return statement inside the bird. So we have move, display, get position, die, get status. Let's add reset. So this makes it possible to reset the bird from our game logic. So up here in our game, when we get the score 2 or above, we change the game state back to 0. We set the score to 0. And let's go ahead and reset our birds so they won't be in the middle of the screen. We could also reset the player. The player might be off on the side of the screen. We might want the player to be, somewhere else. So we could reset the player as well. But that's, the basic idea. So games and most interactive applications are sort of a combination of different states that we have to track, and then logic that determines when those states change. So when we capture a bird, we have to change the score, we have to update our animations, and then once we've captured a number of birds and we hit a new threshold, we have to decide what to do when we hit that new threshold. So I'll set this back to 10, and I'll set my game state back to 0, so it'll start on the home screen again. And yeah, that's it for now. So I'll stop